Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Robert from Islam for Europeans. Uh, I'm back. You probably noticed that I haven't made a video in over a year. Just wanted to tell a little bit about why that was. So basically, I wanted to take a break. I'm making a lot of videos, over 200 actually, over a 5 year period. We discussed a lot of really important issues that are facing Muslim communities in the West, how that affects converts, how that affects born Muslims, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our humble good deeds for discussing these issues and bringing them to the forefront. But I just want to let people know that I'm doing okay. Um, right now I'm writing a book, which is basically a book format of what we're discussing here on the channel. The name of the book is going to be called "How Islam Can Save the West." I've written about 20,000 words, so I'm about 40% written. Other than that, I've just been living in London. I have a much better job now. Still running the tennis league, playing lots of tennis. Yeah, things are going pretty good for me. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, I have no complaints. But yeah, I just wanted to give a big thanks, to all the people who supported Islam for Europeans from the first period. And I just one of the main reasons why I wasn't making any videos was because my laptop basically died. I completely ran out of RAM. Couldn't be fixed, but I just got a new laptop, alhamdulillah. So I want to start making videos again. There's a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about, and one of the issues that I wanted to bring up, which would be the topic for this video, is the problem of lack of data. Now, you'll know that I talk about the movie Moneyball a lot. It's one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen it, please do. It stars Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. It's about how um, baseball was run by the basically organized by the scouts, and they would determine who would be the best ball players, for the teams that they worked for, based on non-scientific criteria. So how the sound that the ball would make when they hit it with the bat, right down to how attractive their girlfriend was, um, or they would judge players negatively based on behavior off the field and so on and so forth. In the 1970s, there was a statistician that came along by the name of Bill James, and he wrote this series of books called Sabermetrics. And what he did was he just looked at existing baseball data of baseball players, their on base percentage, their hitting percentage, and if they're pitchers, their earned run average, and just figure out who are the best players based on mathematics, right? So this idea was originally hated in the baseball world. It languished on the shelf for more than 20 years. It was, cast aside as, unscientific, as quackery. It wasn't until a general manager by the name of Billy Bean, who was played by Brad Pitt in the movie Moneyball, um, implemented the idea in full, and history. After that, it was a historic season, and now every single baseball club, in fact, every single sports club, uses computers in analyzing who are going to be the best players. So I draw this parallel a lot with not just how to deal with converts living in the West, but all sorts of things. Like, for example, general attitudes of the general population, the non-Muslim population has, toward Islam and Muslims in general, as opposed to just measuring Islamophobia, which is just a measure of like sheer, anti-Islam incidents. Um, the problem with writing this book and the problem with my channel is that we have a lack of evidence. And, a lot of these assumptions that we make or statements that we make, if you've lived in Muslim communities in the West for as long as I have, or even for a couple of months or years, you can you know say, yes, Rob has said that, and I agree with that statement. But you can't really, many of these things we can't really prove. We don't have really a lot of data. And I think this is inherent to, Muslims living in the West, in that, we don't study research. When I went to, university and I did my master's degree, I was one of very few Muslims who went into psychology. Most Muslims go into STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. They don't go into any of the social sciences, which is understandable because there's less money in it. But even something as simple as stating, let's use this as an example, that Muslims in the West don't interact very often, or sometimes not at all, with the larger non-Muslim public. As opposed to, say, converts who were born and raised in a non-Muslim family, who have greater ties through blood, or people that they knew their entire lives, right? Even a statement like that, if I were to say that in a book, they would say, where's your evidence, right? And to anyone living in the West, especially in Canada, it's a pretty obvious statement. I mean, I know Muslims who lived in Toronto their whole lives, the GTA their whole lives, and they say, I don't even have any white friends. So, and then the opposite is also true. I know many non-Muslims who have never met a Muslim in their life or had any relationship with them, maybe beyond seeing them in the mall or something. They've never been to a mosque, and so on and so forth. But without evidence, if I make that claim in a book, people are just going to discard it. So, and you can extrapolate this to many other statements that I've made throughout the years, that seem simple on the surface, and you say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but there's no data really to back it up. And another example is Islamophobia. you know um, how have we studied the population of Western countries in general, and gotten their opinions on Islam, Muslims, immigration, foreign policy issues? The research is very scant. There was one study done by a group called More in Common in the UK, and the results were very contrarian to what many Muslims believe about non-Muslim Westerners. There's some non-Muslim Westerners who think they all hate us, or it's very black and white. Either they hate us or they love us, and so on and so forth. But they found that 40% of non-Muslim Westerners in the UK have a neutral image of Muslims. They don't care, they don't know, right? And then I think 21% had a very negative or very negative view of Muslims, and like 35% had a positive or very positive view. That's a very stark contrast, from what we think, right? But the other problem with that is that even when you do the research, Muslims don't really look at it. They just discard it. What point is in there? It's almost like, what's the point of doing research if it's not going to change the way Muslims think, if it's not going to change the way that mosques, run things, you know, um, and there's that study by Yaqeen Institute that found that, for example, 70% of converts to Islam at the time of their conversion had a non-Muslim boyfriend or girlfriend. Now you can say, maybe there's other reasons why, Muslims don't want to bring this issue up. And then, there's the whole effect of, and this is, across the board in terms of, social science research, is that um, people don't really read these studies beyond other people who are doing their PhD, or who are professors, or are doing an undergrad, at most an undergraduate degree. These studies aren't available to the general public. Now, the study the Yaqeen Institute did is available to the general public, but mosques don't really look at data or statistics and go, okay, this is what is really going on. How are we going to adjust how we say things, how we do things, and let's worry about optics. So that makes things difficult, right? And on top of that, let's say you wanted to do a study. Let's say a mosque wanted to do a study on, say, you know, um, Muslims in the West and like health behaviors, or like exercise or things like that. It doesn't have to be related to religion. And let's say, okay, we'll do a survey. We'll send out survey questionnaires at the mosque. We'll say at the end of the Friday prayer, why don't you take this survey? It's for the health of the Muslim community, right? The problem with that is that only people who go to a mosque are going to fill out this questionnaire, right? So you're going to get what's called dropout bias or selection bias. You know, Only the mosque goers, the people who are more religious, more men than women, obviously, are going to fill out these surveys. You're going to leave out a chunk of the Muslim community who is quote unquote unmosqued or they're not practicing or so on and so forth. So, and that's why you need people who are trained in social science research to do these studies, because if you don't understand these biases, your findings are going to be skewed. And you can extrapolate this to the whole convert situation. The only Most of the converts that the Muslim community sees are the ones that are going to the mosque on a regular basis. They're not the people that the converts that take the shahada and then you never see them again, right? So that's the problem that I'm facing with this book, and I do want to get it written. I do think that it's going to be, inshallah, a really a bestseller. But my plan is to finish writing it. I have to finish writing a rough draft of the book, all 200 pages or so, and also a series of questionnaires, so that when the new school season starts in September, I can find some undergraduates or some other research group to actually help me complete these questionnaires, so we can at least have some baseline data, right? Now, let's say we do the questionnaires, we get our data, and my hypothesis wasn't correct. Let's say that we did a study on Muslim attitudes towards non-Muslims. What do they, what percentage, you ask Muslims, what percentage of non-Muslims hate Muslims and Islam? What percentage are neutral about it? And what percentage have a positive image? And the responses that they give are, pretty much equal when you survey non-Muslims, what they think about, Muslims and Islam, right? If that's the case, I will gladly acquiesce my position. I will say, Rob was wrong. I was incorrect. And, I will gladly do that. But, at least we're putting this forward and saying, we need to conduct more research so we're not walking around blind, because that's basically what the Muslim community is doing, right? And we're challenging some of these dominant narratives, that are going on in the Muslim community. The narratives that I just stated. Other narratives like, converts are so much better than us. Converts are these superstars. A lot of us are just as flawed as the rest of the Muslim community, or that they all hate is fallacy, that which I've mentioned before. Or measuring, instead of measuring Islamophobia, just general attitudes about Muslims and Islam across the general public, which I think would be much more effective. And just focus groups on what kind of language should we be using when we're on YouTube, when we're presenting our ideas to the general public? What would work, what wouldn't work, right? I think those are all really important questions to ask. I think that those are questions we haven't asked in a very long time. There's a point I wanted to make. I'm just going to pause it for a second. Yeah, so at the same time, these dominant narratives that live within Muslims in the West, it's important to realize that they don't have a lot of evidence. They don't have the evidence either. They just, and no one questions it. If a lot, you'll have Muslims say, I saw one Facebook comment that was like, white people hate us, so we're going to hate them in return, which is very generalized, sweeping, brushstrokes, to paint against the entire community. When the data suggests otherwise. Yes, there are white people who don't like Muslims, but pro-Palestinian, sentiment about foreign policy issues have been almost a complete 180, especially when you're looking at people who are aged 40 and younger. They don't like these wars. They want them to end. And you've seen a massive increase in people taking their shahada, converting to Islam as well. So if anything, you can present the statistics at the very most, there's many things that the Muslim community says where they don't have the data to back it up, just like us. The us in terms of on top of the people at Islam for Europeans who agree with me. So the onus is on us because we're challenging a dominant narrative, and that's going to require a lot of careful research and a lot of sincerity, and at the end of the day, good-heartedness, because we're not challenging these positions, to one up people. We're not challenging them to say, we were right and you were wrong. We're not doing it. We don't have this type of, we want this type of revenge motive. We're doing this, make the intention that we're doing this sincerely, for the sake of Islam in the West and, the success of Muslim communities living there. And then that's all. We're not doing this to be malicious or anything. We want to invite people to these types of dialogues. But I think that, it's long overdue that, we need to actually do a lot of research because, like I said, the other side is doing millions of dollars in research. I mean, any company, Boeing or Ford, any company, any large company, that is on the Dow Jones Industrial, they spend millions of dollars on research and development. Because they're visionary. They look years, decades into the future. What research have Muslim communities done? There are Muslim organizations out there. There's the ISPU. They do research on Muslim communities. But it's a lot more work needs to be done. I mean, there's only so much that they can do with the limited funding that they have, and on top of that, you know, our Muslim communities, our masajid, are they going to listen, to the findings that we have, and the recommendation that we represent? I think that's going to be very vital moving forward, and I hope that this book will allow us, to add to the discussion. So that's all my time for the day. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Again, apologies that I haven't made a video in 16 months, but it's good to be back. Assalamu alaikum to all of my Muslim friends who are watching me, and a big hello to all of my non-Muslim audience that watches me as well. And that's my time for the day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.